Thanks very much. And thank you very much, Frank and Peter, and inviting me along and everyone for coming along. And I acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land. So I wanted to take a moment to reflect on something good that's happened, because we don't normally do that when we talk about budgets, particularly under coalition governments. So I want to take you back first 20 years, and I'm going to take you forward from 20 years on and just reflect on where we are now compared to where we were then. So 20 years ago, we were about to experience the first Howard Costello budget. They were going to try and do something very similar to what the first Abbott hockey budget tried to do. They were going to gut funding to higher education. They were going to substantially transfer income to private health insurance. They were going to cut money to public schools. The main difference between then and now, of course, is they managed to do virtually all of those things. The hockey and Abbott government failed in most respects to be able to do most of what it was trying to do. We'll go forward a little bit to 1999-2000. Part of the ramping up of the tax cuts that Frank was talking about is that the Howard Costello government is now going to cut in half the capital gains tax for anyone who holds a property or an investment for more than 12 months. Then, only just over 10 years ago, during the windfall gains of the mining tax, we have a substantial cut in tax on superannuation, introduced with virtually no opposition or resistance, in fact, virtually bipartisan consensus. And then we go to the last election that looks a little bit like this one, where there was a Conservative government in power and Labor was looking to challenge in 2007. And we had one of the largest tax cuts in history put on the table, and we had a Labor opposition that in lockstep agreed to virtually all of it. And in fact, that large tax cut, while proposed by the coalition, was actually implemented by the Rudd government. It's a different story now. We now have a coalition government which is trying to position itself as being even harder than Labor on getting rid of superannuation tax concessions. We have a Labor opposition which is now committed to winding back negative gearing and restoring most of the capital gains tax concession that was implemented earlier on. Most of those cuts have been resisted, not all of them, and in fact the largest one, which hasn't yet come into force, is the large cut to funding to state governments through schools and hospitals, which is due to take effect from July 1st this year. And I think one of the most important things to look for in this budget is exactly what happens to that. But already we've had the Labor opposition commit to fully funding the Gonski model, that is the money that is going to be contributed to public education through the federal government, although we haven't yet heard from what they're going to do about hospitals. So I reckon that's a reasonably good story. Now, it's not a great story. Inequality is still growing in Australia. Corporations are still remarkably powerful, and there's a number of things I'm going to talk about now which might make us slightly more pessimistic. But I think it's actually really important to occasionally reflect and say, look, compared to where we were a decade ago, this is a remarkable turnaround in Australian economic political history. We've gone to a point where it is now normal to talk about how we ensure that large corporations pay more tax, how we try to enforce more equitable tax scales, and despite the rhetoric from the Treasurer, there is an acceptance even within the coalition that there is a revenue problem, even if they pretend not to acknowledge it. So we've come a long way. But I think there are two outstanding problems that we need to think through. One of those, I'm going to suggest, is that reflecting that debate about revenue is in Australia, taxation really isn't taxation at the moment. We have the equivalent of a bucket for money that has a series of holes at the top, which means that anyone at the top of the distribution who are supposed to be paying more actually end up paying less. And particularly at the federal level, spending ends up not really being spending. That is, the commitments to health and education and transport, things we would normally think of as part of a commitment to collectivism and to equity, end up actually being often the opposite of that. because it's the federal government that primarily funds our private schools, that has been committed to funding large tollways, and that funds the private health insurance rebate. So it's actually increases in spending at the federal level actually tangibly increase inequality, increase individualisation and fragmentation, and undermine the public sector. So it's fixing those two things, I think, that any reasonable-minded progressive person would try to address in this budget. And there is some evidence that some of those things are starting to happen. But we still have enormous holes in the tax system. And those holes are not just a revenue problem, they're also a problem for the way that government policies in a whole range of areas operate. So the enormous gaping hole in the tax system when it comes to fossil fuels, for example, is one of the primary reasons we're not currently in the middle of what should be a concerted effort to retool our economy from one that's carbon intensive to one that's renewable. We have over $10 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies, which are primarily in the form of tax concessions. One of the reasons that a whole generation of people is in danger of being locked out of the housing market is again because of the interaction of negative gearing and the capital gains tax concession, which are not just a problem for revenue, they are one of the primary problems that's driving the housing crisis in cities like Sydney, and which is actually driving part of the spending problem that governments have. If you look at government spending on housing, that spending, go back 20 years, most of that spending was part of a Commonwealth state housing arrangement to try and support social and affordable housing. Now the majority of it goes into subsidising Commonwealth rent assistance, as essentially payments to subsidise the rent of low-income people in private rental accommodation. It's subsidising and in fact bidding up prices in private rental because we've shifted our system of support from one that provides collective goods to one that subsidises private purchase in markets. And then we've introduced a series of tax concessions that rapidly increase the prices in private markets and just force the government to keep on paying in order to try and match them. So we've got the ridiculous situation where not only have we massively expanded the amount the government spends on Commonwealth rent assistance, but 40% of the people who receive it are still in poverty because they're not able to afford their rent, because the rents are increasing so rapidly. So we have some very serious problems. We could say a very similar thing about superannuation and its interaction with the age pension. We now have a system of retirement income assistance from the federal government where the private component in the tax concessions on superannuation is growing more rapidly than the public component. If we go back a little while, remember superannuation's introduced to try and ease the burden on the budget that apparently the age pension was going to provide. Now, our solution to that ends up to actually be worse than the illness itself and is now costing more and growing faster than spending on the public pension. But in doing that, because it subsidises private accounts, again, the government has now taken to bidding up the prices in private markets by subsidising private purchases. We're starting to see a substantial increase in inequality of people of retirement age, people above 65. The level of inequality is starting to grow substantially because we're blowing out the amount we give to people at the very top. So one of our challenges has to be to make sure that taxation, the system of taxation, which is actually very progressive, at least in the letter of the tax scales that you go and see on the ATO site, ensuring that those tax scales actually are the tax scales that are implemented in practice. The other challenge is to make sure that spending is spending. And we heard the worst of this during that debate where Malcolm Turnbull tried to reorganise for one brief night the Federation and tried to ensure that the states had some money to be able to spend on the things that they need to spend on. And what did he say? He said, well, of course that will mean that the federal government won't have to contribute any money to public schools, because that's really a state responsibility. The core responsibility of the federal government, he said, was to fund private schools. That's what the core responsibility of the federal government was, to fund private schools. Not only that, through this rearrangement, we would make sure that the states were able to properly take account of public hospitals, which would free up the federal government to concentrate on its priority of funding the private health insurance rebate. And while we have heard from Malcolm Turnbull that there's been the beginnings of a turning around on transport policy, we still have a situation in Victoria where he refuses to fund a public transport scheme proposed by a democratically elected government, partly on the very platform that it opposed an expansion of motorways and supported an increase in public transport, and insists that that money should go to increasing the road network. Here in Sydney, we have the federal government continuing to contribute to the WestConnex project, rather than directly investing in public transport. So what looks like spending that we would imagine would be contributing to equality, the collective good, is in fact doing the opposite. So there actually are quite a number of ways in which the federal government, if it chose to, could rein in spending. We could look to redirect money on the basis of need in our schooling system, and we could look to phase out and eventually eliminate the private health insurance rebate. Billions of dollars which are waiting there to be reallocated into better investment. The other area I think that is important to be able to touch on in any analysis of the budget is what things are seen as untouchable. Those parts of the budget where there seems to be a consensus that it's of overwhelming importance that they get funded. One can commit literally billions of dollars in order to do that, and almost no one raises a peep. And there are two of those, both of which have been in remarkable crisis over the last 12 months, but both of which there seems to be an unnerving and unwavering commitment to. So one is defence spending, where we've had substantial announcements of very large sums being committed to the expansion of our military resources. Now, I'm all for reinvigorating the manufacturing base of Australia, but since when did the progressive side of politics decide that the best way to defend manufacturing jobs was to build frigates and submarines for our armed forces, rather than build anything that remotely resembles something that would actually contribute to national well-being? I think is actually one of the biggest problems that progressive politics faces is not only have we virtually abandoned the field on industry policy entirely, but the semblance of industry policy that still seems to be supported, including by elements of the union movement, is overtly militaristic. The other part of the untouchable budget, which has also just entered into crisis, is offshore detention. Something where it doesn't seem to matter just how much money you spend on it, no matter how big the bill becomes, billions of dollars can be spent housing a couple of hundred people. It is apparently a bill that the federal government is willing to pay. And again, like the issues around taxation and like the issues around spending, these are not just issues about how much money we spend. They are also, of course, issues about the kind of country we are. And unfortunately, they're now also not just issues about the kind of country we are, but the kind of region we live in that we are so committed to enforcing a border protection policy that tortures people and sets up concentration camps at extraordinary expense to the taxpayer, that we have our immigration minister publicly canvassing how we can intervene in Papua New Guinea to help the Prime Minister there undermine their constitution and a decision of their Supreme Court. So it's hard to see that, I was thinking at the beginning of the day that this was a version of neo-colonialism, but you'd have to say it's probably just old-fashioned colonialism, that the Australian government is essentially, has already set up one client state in Nauru, something that's now been essentially acknowledged by our own High Court, even in the majority verdict in Nauru, where they said it was okay to keep on imprisoning people on Nauru. Even the majority of the judges acknowledged that that policy was effectively being implemented and overseen by the Australian government. That is, that the Nauru government was not in charge of what is notionally its largest industry. It's become a client state of Australia. But now we also have in Papua New Guinea a form of overt colonialism where our government seeks to undermine the constitution of a neighbour. So there are very important questions that are going to be raised by the budget. Unfortunately, those ones won't even get a look in. But we will get a little bit of a peek into some of the others. So we've had some good news on superannuation concessions, something that seems now to have bipartisan support to gradually rein in. And we've had a substantial shift by the Labor Party on capital gains and negative gearing, a position that they certainly didn't look like taking even 3 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. So it is possible, in fact, that that will be a bipartisan consensus in about 3 years' time as well. The final thing that I wanted to finish on was starting to think through the way that both our tax policies and our spending policies are not only undermining the budget, but they're starting to create a fragmentation of, we might say, our public space generally, of our public sphere. The combination of those tax concessions in housing and in retirement incomes, of those spending policies on healthcare and education, has been to construct in Australia over about the last 25 years a dual system of public institutions, or of institutions that cater to our basic needs. A private system alongside a public system. Both of those systems are underpinned by public money. The private system in every single one of these spheres can't operate without the government essentially forcing money into those sectors. And in each of them, they are now directly contributing to the most tangible forms of inequality that we are experiencing. Not just inequality of income in any given year, but of an intergenerational widening of the gap between rich and poor. That is not a generational war. So it's not that 75-year-old retirees on the Central Coast are somehow in war with 27-year-old professionals living in Surrey Hills. That's not the real basis of what's going on. I'm 37, and by the time I retire, most of the people in my age bracket probably will own their own home. But at the moment, less than 10% of people who are dependent, who are over 65 and retired, less than 10% of those people have to in any way engage with the private rental market. When I retire, at the moment it's looking like it'll be more like 30%. It'll still be a minority, but it'll be a very large one. And we know that those people who currently are reliant on the age pension and forced into the private rental market are people at the highest risk of poverty. We know that pretty much the only way out of that is for them to move often hundreds of kilometres away from all of their support networks into small rural towns where there are very few facilities but where they can afford the rent, until eventually their health gives out, they end up being in a hospital in emergency, and it's only then that they might qualify to get up the waiting list and into public housing. A point at which they probably already have 5 to 10 years taken off their life expectancy. Now, that is a national tragedy that's currently occurring. It's occurring in reasonably small numbers, but that is going to grow. We know that our education system is currently being transformed into one that looks much, much more similar to the United States, where while a majority of people will continue to go to public schools, increasingly the middle class, and particularly the white middle class, will have fled into the private education system, and through that will have created a process of intergenerational inequality, where the children of working class people are essentially streamed into low paid and insecure jobs. So this system of dualised welfare that's supported by both the tax and the spending system is not just increasing inequality in any given year, it is gradually, over generations, rebuilding Australian institutions so that we break down the mechanisms that we've had up until now that help to ensure that there is generational mobility and there are real choices for the children of people, for most Australians. never for all, particularly not for Indigenous Australians, but for many more Australians than will be the case in the future. So breaking down those spending and tax systems is vital to be able to do that. This system is going to take, it already has been building for 10 to 20 years, it's going to take another 10 to 20 years to be able to deliver those kinds of awful results. So we do have time to be able to do it. We do have some momentum up that we have started to tackle them. But if we can't push that through, and if we can't start to dismantle the systems that have been built over the last 20 years, we're into for some serious problems in the next generation. Thanks very much.